Happy to say hello to everybody. Yeah, it's great. Well, look, a lot of new faces. Wonderful. This is really cool because obviously the journal came together towards the end of last year, and then the Integration Society. So many new faces as part of that. And this is the first. We've done two research for this year, but this is the first we've done where it's focusing on a specific initiative. So this initiative, obviously, we're going to hear all about it, but Gregg got involved with the Institute over a year ago with the Unified Worldview initiative, which was kind of a precursor effort to a lot of what we'll talk about today. And this is, I would say, a maturation and probably a better instantiation of really what's intended to try to accomplish with a broader group of people too. So that's very exciting. And I think it's probably a good time to announce that with the launch of this initiative, with today's presentation, Gregg, the Institute will back this initiative with a starting gift for supporting the initiative, a financial gift to kick it off. And we really want to continue to support the scholars that are doing these kinds of efforts. So if you have ideas for initiatives in key research vectors that the society is looking at and that the research team has outlined in the first research forum that we did, please raise your hand. I mean, that's why we've built this platform. And platform, I mean social platform to do this. So very excited to hear about this, Gregg, and let's get rolling.
Great. Oh, that's my heart is warm. That's super lovely. I look forward to talking with everyone in the room, So thank you for this. Okay. So, natural philosophy 2.0, a new frame for an old discipline. All right. And here's the logo. At least the current working logo. We'll have AI do it better at some point. Okay. But this captures the essence of what I'm after. And so I'm going to start then with the proposal in a nutshell. Okay. Ultimately, what I'm after is an organizing frame that can address the following question. How do we understand the natural world and our place in it such that it all hangs together? That's a Larry frame. Okay, into a coherent worldview. That to me binds natural philosophy 2.0 and actually bridges certainly into natural philosophy 1.0 in a particular way, which I'll address. Okay. There's a frame that's on the table, a frame for thinking about the world, and I'll come back to what exactly I mean by frame, but it's fairly obvious in the visual depiction. It's this thing. And embedded in this thing are the following. There's a down frame, a down vector. There's a back vector. There's an up vector. There's an over vector. And initially there's an out, but I quickly realized in talking to people, it's an out to get back in vector. Okay. And the elements of this vectoring structure bind together the following into a natural philosophy. They bind together modern empirical natural science knowledge that is consensually agreed upon and binds to the physical reductive, now not in a philosophical sense, I mean in a scientific sense, view of the universe down and back. We will be able to trail a natural history through line from the so-called beginning to now. And the argument is we need a natural philosophy frame of understanding, a descriptive metaphysical, systemic frame that places our ontological understanding, our epistemological understanding together, binds our natural science knowledge on a historical line, and then also hands it to us in a way that is meaningful. That's what's on, and then situates ultimately, and I believe, and then we'll talk to people like Rob Scott and Baron Short and talk about why this kind of binding at the level of human experience sets the stage for insights that can be aligned with sort of the core general Eastern Enlightenment. Okay? That I'm not going to be talking about today, but I'm open to then dialoguing. Okay, so that's a secondary aspect of the frame, super important. I'm going to be focused on the down, back, up, and over. And I'm going to be then working with others to develop the out and in, and we'll be coming back to those frames. Okay. So let's shift then from there, and like I said, if there are any particular questions, into where is this, how do we situate this? And the part one of this talk then is Natural Philosophy 1.0, Understanding Natural Science and the Current State of Our Consensual Knowledge Structure, meaning the generalizable frames of reference that large numbers of people would more or less agree with. Okay. What is Natural Philosophy 1.0? Well, it's an old discipline. It was the systematic and scholarly inquiry into the natural world as separate from and differentiated from the supernatural world in Christendom. Okay. And thus, Christendom had within it a worldview identifiable in terms of the great chain of being. And natural philosophy was the natural part of us, humans, down into the world of other animals, into the world of plants and living organisms, into the world of rocks and the cosmos in general. And then it was then to see, the idea was we were joined with a supernatural soul around which angels and God overlooked us on a separate supernatural plane of existence. That's the basic substance dualistic worldview that defined Christendom for a long time. And we can see, just as a pointer, in terms of the natural world, the levels, layers, etc., are actually represented directly by the tree of knowledge. In 19th century, natural philosophy transforms into natural science. Wilhelm Weyl, maybe Larry probably knows how to pronounce that, but introduces the term scientist in 1833. Then we get a formalization stemming from Bacon and others, but then getting systematized into a third-person empirical methodology that's going to become loosely, and obviously there's debate about this as to whether there really is such a thing, but loosely framed as the scientific method anchored to things like data collection, experimentation, quantification. And then an emerging professionalization of various disciplines that are then pursuing particular lines of inquiry. Universities develop labs and shift from being essentially solely teaching institutions to institutionalizing the research. And I would argue there were philosophical developments, okay, about the nature of reality that started to seriously question the substance, the dual substance worldview. Some of the ways in which physical energy causal closure emerged. Basically, it was very hard to fit additional causes into the system as a generalized understanding. And of course, Darwin and theory of evolution really then added serious questions as to whether or not we had been created by an intelligent designer. But regardless of all of that, for our purposes, we want to be aware that what used to be philosophy and theology as scholarly, we then ultimately end up fracturing, for better or worse, the split between science and philosophy. Philosophy ultimately is going to go on to split into analytic and continental, broadly defined. Larry can talk a lot about that. And of course, then what was natural philosophy becomes natural science. And natural philosophy as a category becomes defunct. And this is, of course, what we're trying to revive. The argument is that they vacated that architecture in a way that's deeply problematic. What is natural philosophy now? Well, there's a shell of a discipline, but I would argue that we can look out and see that there's placeholders for it, and there are key elements for us to be thinking about where things are now, where they might be relative for the Natural Philosophy 2.0 group. And some of our things just to kind of consider that we're going to be is, well, what do we mean by philosophy and natural philosophy? Like, how do we understand that? What is it now? How do we understand it historically? This proposal seeks to bind to natural history, most obviously through like the big history learning system frame of reference, but also natural history historically and in general. And also, what is science? So we have to think systematically about what we mean by these terms, how they interrelate, science, history, and philosophy in general, and then natural in relationship to, and their relation. In relationship to natural, I think we want to be clear at various times or take the opportunity to be clear about what we mean by these terms. I'll share what I mean by the terms when I'm using them. So when I use the word nature, I mean everything sans human technology. So the nature, if I go into nature, it's because I'm leaving the city. and I'm leaving my phone behind, and I'm bonding with nature, that means I'm separating out technology from it. However, when I refer to the natural world, then that includes things like obviously this cup is part of the natural world in this sense, and that is the separation of this world from the supernatural world. And the other thing I want to make sure we attend to is the concept of naturalism itself. Naturalism is a large category in philosophy. And there are a whole host of naturalisms. Indeed, I started with a transcendent naturalism. A subset of that was an extended naturalism. Naturalism is essentially a scholarly and philosophical position that says there is only one world, or we only operate within one world at the level of sort of our intellectual, reliable, valid understanding. And then you get into things like, well, science is a methodologically naturalistic, is it ontologically, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a whole class within philosophy and science called naturalism. I actually think that that should be held under an identity discipline called natural philosophy. So that then natural philosophy holds the different naturalisms as I'm envisioning it. Well, what is this? Actually, Peter Deer just released this book, The World as We Know It. At a descriptive level, he gives a really nice historical articulation of the evolution of natural philosophy into natural history, tells when the transition happened. He offers an interesting point that I want to kind of emphasize in relation. So he trails the continuity of natural history and natural philosophy, and frames this as, well, the natural philosophy side is really trying to get an understanding. Okay. It's trying to frame the meaning of this. Okay. And that sort of should continue in his own mind. And that creates a sense of continuity. As we separate out, say, the disciplinary fractions, the empirical analyses, etc., which of course care about understanding, but they're more small world understanding, to use a frame from John Vervaeke. The large contextual world that we live in then requires a philosophical system of understanding. And that's one of the things that I'd like to point to in relationship to why the concept of natural philosophy is really important. There are influential books, if we look out, and if this discipline were a real thing, that I think would clearly fall under this heading of natural philosophy. This is where the gap is. And we see this in the entire big picture world in E.O. Wilson's Consilience, in my view. He quickly identifies as a naturalist. He's a biological naturalist, and he wants to see a naturalistic worldview that bridges the natural sciences, the humans, the social sciences, and the humanities into a unity. One of the big themes about the natural perspective is asking the one-many question and seeing where there is unification. Sean Carroll's The Big Picture identifies as a poetic naturalism from a physicist's perspective, but sees and embraces certainly the need to describe the emergent world, although he has serious questions about its ontological character, but certainly describing the emergent world in the big picture, and he identifies it as a poetic naturalism. Of course, our friend Bobby Azarian takes a meta-poetic naturalism, and we can point to some of that. And then here's Dave Christian and his origin story of big history. So for me, all of these are basic structures that tell us, hey, here's a frame of reference that is emerging, that binds our shared understanding of the natural world, and this would fall under a natural philosophy 2.0 heading. However, okay, there's also some other elements that are explicitly that I want to mention here that are looking to revive this. Paul Thurgard, he's a psychologist, philosopher, framed his work on consciousness into the social world, into knowledge, as a work of natural philosophy and a calling to natural philosophy. Alistair McGrath's book here on natural philosophy, on reimagining a lost disciplinary imaginary, was very, very consistent with the vision that I outlined. And I found it to be an excellent book. And in terms of how he thinks philosophy, why we lost it, and what we can recover, he does a really nice job in relationship to that. And more at the level of popular, because this actually gets written up in the popular press, Sean Carroll, who's obviously super, he's well known across a wide variety of different things, has a lot of clout. In May of 2025, he produced has a natural philosophy forum, had a conference, Anil Seth, and many other people who are quite prominent. And one of the things for our natural philosophy group to consider is reaching out to these folks if we decide that there's a credible approach here to natural philosophy 2.0. There's essentially a call for it from this forum. And from certainly something that his collaborator, Sean Carroll's collaborator, who's in the philosophy department, is looking for. So here's actually almost a place where we could go that has clout that would bring. So that gives us a structural kind of like, where are we? But what is it about this proposal then that just doesn't kind of fall under that heading and say, well, yeah, sure, we should revive this? And this, I think, which makes it, binds us here in the Institute, binds ourselves together, certainly binds my work to a lot of the work that's in here. And here's a central claim that I'll make. Modern science and the current big picture viewpoints give us a cosmology. But that is not a coherent worldview. They're giving us a cosmology. That is, they're framing the outline that gives us some grip on understanding aspects of the world. But this point, and this is some of my conversations with Brendan, kind of really just popped this home in relationship to what's going on here and this new story of wholeness and some of the work that Brendan is doing in relationship to worldviews. What is a worldview? Yeah, it requires an epistemology, i.e. shared understanding, what's true, what's good, and how do we justify. An ontology, what is real, and how do we know about it. An axiology, like what is value, and what should we value, what do we value, and how do we negotiate that, and what do we do in the world? Like what are our practices? How do we bind in relation? A worldview to guide humans in the world, at a minimum, requires these four elements to be any degree, to be sufficient in the minimum. Okay? Christianity gives you that. All right, Christendom is provided by a worldview. Here's God, here's this is what you're trying to do. You're trying to live your life. This is how it actually works with the natural world does this. And ultimately, you live your life to return in a Christ-like way to God. That's the value structure. That's the practice structure. That's the argument. Okay. I would argue that modern science completely fails to provide humans a coherent worldview regarding how to live in the world. And so this is a strong argument I want to make that I think has been sort of perhaps overlooked. It certainly hit me in a way that I sort of intuited this for a long time, but some of the conversations made this clear to me. So the reasons really are obvious. First, natural science is designed, so we talk about natural science in particular, but the entire sort of scientific methodology is essentially designed to factor out subjective and social forms of knowing. It's not a method to determine what is morally good, for instance. It is not really a method to get at, or it's a very difficult method to get at what is subjectively valued, especially from the indexical point of view of the unique particular. It's designed, justified-wise, to a reliable and valid knowledge. So if you have a unique particular point of view that is not accessible from the third point of perspective and is totally different from everybody else, it's not really fitting. It's error in the scientific worldview. It is not part of the reliable, valid knowledge structure. Certainly not any reasonable knowledge structure that humans could apply. Maybe you could say, well, God could figure out how all of this would work. But human knowledge in science is reliable and generalizable knowledge, not unique, particular, coincidental. Our lives themselves, however, are unique, particular, coincidental from an indexed point of view, hence the subjective point of view. But science factors that out, doesn't give us that. And even more dramatically, and I tell you this as a psychologist, it even more dramatically fails fundamentally to extend our ontology beyond physics and biology. So the natural scientists do not extend coherently into the mental and cultural dimensions of existence. Okay? And therefore, they completely fail to embed us in the world and address both issues of value and issues of practice. And Natural Philosophy 2.0 identifies this as the Enlightenment gap. The Enlightenment gap refers to the problem of placing and defining mind and consciousness in the material world and aligning the objective knowledge of the natural sciences with the subjective and social forms of knowing. This is a central point I make in the book. And basically, there's an ontological problem. What do you mean by mind and consciousness? And how do you place it in the natural world? And there's an epistemological problem. This is the way natural science knows. It reaches a limit function, to use a Rob Smith term, and does not actually bind usefully to certain aspects of subjective and social forms of knowing. Just think morality, if you really want to just ask a quick question. Do you ask natural science to tell you what is good? and it immediately becomes silent. And the problems you can see are everywhere. So in his Consilience, E.O. Wilson basically says there's an unbridgeable gap. And more or less he says we have reasonable, although they're good questions about the nature of biology. The natural sciences for him are clearly biological sciences into the physical, chemical sciences. And he more or less, although he doesn't use this exact typology, if you pay attention to what he's arguing, he's essentially laying this picture of the universe out. But the problem is, and I would argue we see this problem everywhere when we ask consensually, do we have a holistic picture? The problem is we get into the brain, and that reduces to biology, but then all of a sudden things get really fuzzy. Wilson argued the problem was the jump to the social sciences. He's got a particular passage I like to quote that articulates that. And I argue our holistic view repeatedly allows us to see why we are missing this point. One example I often point to is Holmes-Rolston's argument for a big picture view that says, hey, there's 3 big bangs. Okay? Well, if we take the tree of knowledge view, this completely obliterates the awareness of the minded animal dimension of existence. And by the way, if you lack that category, your capacity for actually coherent making sense out of the world is going to be defunct and deficient. Okay? So the Enlightenment gap is this deep problem. It can be seen. Wilson points to it in The Bridge of the Natural Sciences. Our friend David Chalmers points to it when he tries to say what is subjective conscious experience and how does a materialist functionalist view of the world explain it. John Vervaeke has talked about cognitive science trying to get established, but actually it's got a complete equivocation problem when it comes to how it frames the mind. Of course, my entire life has been psychology, folks. It's actually not nearly at all coherent. It can't really bind mind and science and behavior together. Okay. And if we go philosophically, there's a profound split between reductionists and the kinds of reduction we should be following versus the various kinds of emergence. And indeed, there are liberal naturalists that say, of course, there's emergence, and that's obviously philosophically necessary to understand human mind. And then there are reductionists saying no, and all sorts of places in between. The point is that there is serious problems in making sense out of the whole where we are trying to place our experiences, our subjective conscious experience, values, human ways of being in the world relative to the natural sciences. Okay? And thus the Enlightenment gap means there's no consensually agreed upon coherent naturalistic worldview because we can't place ourselves as subjects and social worlds into the natural world in the same sense of knowing. Okay? So, and if you can't do that, then you do not have a coherent worldview that's telling you axiologically, praxis, as well as onto epistemologically in a bound structure of being. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second. That's the backdrop of where we are from this vantage point, and see if there are any particular places that anybody wants to pick up on. And if not, I will continue the framing. But this is the structure of, I would argue, like kind of collectively, and by that I mean sort of what's the zeitgeist and the basic frame, the consensual structure. All right. Oh, Mark, you want to go?
Yeah, Greg, so I can see, and excuse me for asking this, it's probably very elementary what I'm going to ask here, but so the natural sciences, the third person sciences, the physical sciences can't adequately place us in a social world.
Uh-huh.
But isn't that what the social sciences actually do? So,
Well,
for example, you get Axel Honneth's, his whole science of recognition, for example, and
right.
which
So,
seems to do a reasonable job. Maybe it doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness, but it certainly seems to place human experience within a social world, a world of first, second, and third person experience. So I'm a little bit unsure about
right.
am
So,
I
okay.
asking a stupid question
You're
here?
not asking us, no, not at all. And this is something to be spent. So I'll put it this way. Epistemologically, absolutely. Ontologically, I don't think so. And what I mean by that is you then can't get a coherent ontology And this is where the problem of psychology is. So I will argue that then, in other words, you're going to take an enormous amount for granted to then epistemologically frame your variables and say, well, this is where we are in relation. But I was like, well, what actually are the variables and how do we get from A to B? Okay. And then I'm going to argue that's what the Enlightenment gap is. So you would have to then say, what I would have to say is, Mark, you would have to point to me how he gets back down to the natural sciences. Okay. That's the challenge. Like you could, if you just start at the social sciences and take the social sciences for granted, all right, and you can then create very cool epistemologically sophisticated analysis that gain all sorts of scientific knowledge about those entities. But you are situated with in an ontological break, meaning there's the biological and physical world down here and the social world up here. That's exactly the break that Consilience is talking about. Like, hey, how do we do that? Okay. So if you don't care about doing that, and there'd be a lot of reasons not to care about it. Okay. Like as a clinician, most clinicians don't care about it. Like I don't need to worry about the ontology of cells relative to brain, higher order brain activity relative to neurocognitive activity as I have a conversation why somebody is sad about why they just got dumped by their significant other. All right. And I can use all sorts of epistemological structures and pragmatic constructivist ideas for how I might help them. So there's definitely a way to isolate this. There's definitely a way to do science here. That's one of the things, okay? Do epistemologically informed science and do very good science. But you've got an ontological problem, for sure. At least this is what I'm arguing. Like, you can't get there from here and back again. That's what I'm saying, okay? And that's where, and I will then put as Exhibit A, the problem of psychology, okay? All of social psychology is nested inside of psychology. I mean, all of the social sciences, I would argue, are nested inside of the problem of psychology. And to the extent that the problem of psychology is such that it's ontologically completely ambiguous about what you mean by mind and behavior and cognition and consciousness of the self, you have massive amounts of ontological ambiguity. That's the, at least in the whole, in the, if your goal is to create a holistic worldview. So that's the claim. Mm-hmm. Tyler?
Could I just follow up
Oh,
just very
sure.
quickly? Wouldn't isn't William James' understanding of radical empiricism, isn't that an ontological, like he would say that like thought and feelings are ontologically real. These are empirical realities. So isn't that sort of a psychological perspective on
It's a
that
psychological, yeah, sure. And
it's
in fact,
not just related to epistemology.
no, it's not. I'm simply saying that when you then ask what you mean by thoughts and feelings, okay, in a natural world, like you have to put them into the natural world. Certainly, I'm not saying no psychologists care about any ontological concepts. That would be that would be weird. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying there's no coherent ontology. So James's neutral monism is something I have a lot of respect for, but it's actually not a coherent ontology. It's a pointer. It's a set of concerns and considerations, but it's not a coherent ontology. And that's what I'm saying is that that's in fact why psychology does what it does across the crisis that Lev Vygotsky talks about. Precisely because there's a multiplicity of different epistemological frames that are trying to grip an aspect of ontology, and they all can't agree. The elephant can't be seen, that is psychology. And ultimately, psychology punts on this issue, meaning that it says, I'm simply going to be epistemologically constructivist, meaning we'll build epistemological models that test operational definitions and move from there. Which is great, but it's not the picture. And there's an ontological problem. Tyler, do you have a comment?
Well, it's along the same lines of what Mark was raising. In other words, you not in other words, but you'll say, Greg, that people are doing this, are building these ladders of understanding, connecting between levels epistemologically, but then you'll just say, but there's an ontological problem.
Huh?
And you define it within when you weave it in your talk, but there's all kinds of people out there in the universities, not claiming that they solved everything, but in the social sciences and the humanities and the philosophy and the psychologies and cognitive science, and all this. And so, and there's a lot of work being done, connecting these levels. And there's still problems, which is why there's researchers doing it. Uh, Yet sometimes in your talk, you'll use phrases like "it absolutely fails," and that bothers me. Um, I mean, why do you think it bothers me?
Well, because if you have an outline and puzzle pieces that are reasonably in place to claim that it absolutely fails as people are making progress on it, feels extreme and doesn't. So that I'll say that.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not it's not strictly the hard problem of consciousness that you're calling your enlightenment gap. I do agree that the sciences for a while put aside the subjective. This was the whole idea of consensual letters being written, journals, peer review. I mean, science is the social structure, very successful because it put in place a social structure. It wasn't just anybody's idea. So I think you framed that part of it very well. So I'm just going to leave that as a comment. Okay.
Good.
At this
Yeah,
point.
no, I think this is I love this, and this is exactly the kind of conversation. And I admit, I will come hard at this particular issue. Okay. I am transformed by the problem of psychology. Okay. And I'm transformed by its pervasiveness, being on the other side of it. So
Right.
that's
Because just one more comment. So somebody could say broadly from the big history perspective, okay, you're saying they're leaving out mindedness of animals, but a lot of people have worked on animal social structure and social learning and that now how that got to humanity, that's one of the bigger questions, of course, but there's a lot of work being done with group meta group organization and what tools did and what language did. So in principle, there is to my mind an ontological um, rough picture there.
okay. Yes. So this is a great point of right. So there's a big history ontological rough picture. And I will say so absolutely. The cosmological ontological rough picture is coming in line and the big history category structure of time by complexity affords us that. Okay.
Okay.
So this is um so this is where we need right. So wait a minute. It's not like we're back with no cosmic evolutionary frame. It's not like we don't know anything about the brain. It's not like we don't know anything about learning. It's not like people aren't studying animals into humans. It's not like we don't have any kind of frame of reference for any of that. We clearly do.
Okay.
Okay. So that's true. Um, we can dialogue then about what this actually. It'd be interesting to yeah. That's what we'll try to get at. Like, what am I saying when I say there's a qualitative? Well, here I'll put it this way. Okay. I say that this hardness. Okay. In science breaks down at psychology. And what do I mean by hard? I mean ontological clarity. Okay? So when you get a bunch of people together in the biological sciences and you ask them what a cell is, pretty good description of that. You ask them what life is, the biology is science of life across systems, exactly where life is, viruses, etc. If you ask them kind of what are the macromolecules in relationship to life, if you ask them how does life evolve over time, okay, you're going to get serious debate, Tyler. You know that. But you are going to get a central set of agreements in relationship to the general architectural structure of your discipline at biology. Okay? That's when you I'll go
Yeah.
right now and find a textbook in press that says psychology is the science of behavior. I'll find you a textbook that says it's the psychology is the science of mind, and I'll find you a textbook that says psychology is the science of mind and behavior.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
And my basic point to you is that the field of psychology can't agree on what it is about. Okay. It doesn't know whether it ends at humans or just humans. It doesn't know how far it goes into the animal kingdom. It doesn't know whether it's a mentalist discipline or a behavioral discipline. It breaks completely down at the level of consensual ontology. Okay. And then it
Okay.
defaults to epistemological methods. That's what I was talking with Mark. So the real, and that's why actually, quote unquote, real scientists look at me and say, you're not a scientist. And when I really get at what they mean is they have reference for what they're talking about in the world that they consensually agreed upon, cells and atoms and biological systems. You say mind, somebody says behavior, somebody says cognition. You don't know what the hell you're talking about, even at the ground level of your identity. And I would agree with that. Okay.
Well, I do want to say I think your mind one, two, three, four. I think that is very interesting. This is not my field, but I think it's very interesting. So I think I think I'll just leave it at what
Right.
I've said.
So as everybody, if we're here at integration, right? So I am making a strong press on one level. Both you and Mark and Tyler and other people rightfully want to contain that press, and I will definitely shift to the middle in many ways. Okay. And we will sort out the precision with what I'm speaking and why I'm pointing and why my life got pulled into this vortex and contextualize it by saying I'm being extreme. Okay. I think we can all agree on both of those things. All right. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, thanks so much for this, Greg. This is awesome. I am sort of dovetailing off what the other comments that are being made here, but I'm curious if I know you draw on Boscar's work in critical realism, but if a critical realist is listening to this, they're thinking, well, I think we have an ontology that does clarify a lot of this stuff, and you draw on it. So that if you could maybe speak to like, where are you kind of pushing off of critical realism, and what is it that you're specifically contributing and clarifying or adding on to, that framework?
Sure. Yeah, again, right, this will be a key element for us to be clear on. Bhaskara's critical realism and the stratification of knowledge basically says there's a necessary way that the world has to be for us to know about it the way we know about it scientifically. And it has to be a stratified realism. And Kantian, the epistemic fallacy is that you essentially are over reducing ontology to epistemology. And I completely agree with that. And I wrote about this in my book, and I detailed why Bhaskara's general picture is very aligned with this. It comes right off of how I'm talking about Larry's picture, and which really basically came off of how Tyler's picture. Okay. So when we go to similarity, and indeed, this is really what I want to basically say, there's a huge amount of similarity that can be specified. Okay. And then be bound into a shared view of ontology. And there's an enormous amount that is available to us already for that. Okay. And people like Bhaskar, people like Nikolai Hartmann, saying, say, hey, there's 4 ontological layers, right? We're back in the 30s in Germany. Okay. Obviously, here's what I'll say. Absolutely, there's a big history ontology. Okay. That gives us a stratified view. That's where we currently are. Okay. But, and this is what I really want to point to. Okay. When we ask of this I'm saying that this is a cosmology. I'm saying it's not a worldview. That's where I'm making the distinction. And I'm pointing to a worldview to say things like, hey, how do I understand myself coherently across the spectrum? Okay. Coherently across the spectrum in the here and now. And this is where I point to the problem of psychology, the work that needs to be done. That relates to the hard problem of consciousness, that relates to defining mind, that relates to overcoming the problem of psychology. And when you do that, okay, you go from the 3 big bangs of Ralston. Yeah, there's 3 big bangs. There's the Big Bang of matter, the Big Bang of life, and the Big Bang of society. Well, okay, but if those are your only 3 big bangs, you are completely missing the ontological layer that needs specification. And so, to go back to Tyler, it would be like we're pointing out a bunch of chemical complexes, but we have no idea what life is. We've got no term for what life is as a category of this kind of functional organization, and then how to specify and interrelate those functional properties into systemic structural systems. The absence of the category of life, which is, by the way, what we have is the absence of the category of mindedness, And clarity by how we became minded primates into justifying persons. Those are the two key insights that I'm basically bringing to this. Okay. There's mindedness as a concept and justification as the jump from primates to persons. And both of those are absolutely conceptually central to making sense out of the world. That's my basic argument. Failure to delineate those things means you're clapping with one hand. You can have an overall picture, but you can't bind it with specificity. And you're not going to be able to jump to the subjective and social in a coherent worldview that situates you as a human being with values in the world. That's what I'm basically, with the level of refinement that we can now achieve. So that's my.
It seems to me, Greg, it seems to me that the one way to say this is that the problem of psychology, because it's the first science of the interior, sort of. The problem of psychology is a canary in the coal mine for any kind of non-purely constructive values that you're going to have in the 21st century, because it breaks. You go from a natural ontology, a hard ontology, to now it insists on constructivism, everything north of that, because you've not been able to anchor the actual phenomenal realities, the mental realities, the social and subjective realities in any ontology. So by force, everything after that is going to live in a constructivist frame, in the sense of your values and everything else going on at the human, subjective, and social world. So the problem of psychology is it's logical that it would show up there as the canary in the coal mine for this whole problem set, actually.
I certainly, I've changed a little bit of language, but totally agree. Indeed, I'd point to the liberal naturals here in Bonnitta. So liberal naturalism basically is the four M's of liberal naturalism: mind as in subjective experience of being in the world, modality, morality, what am I blanking? But basically then justificatory structures of ethics, modes of thought, mathematics, logic, embedded in a structure that then creating a constructivist to constructionist world that needs to be taken into consideration, that has its own causal influences that are novel in relation. That's the liberal naturalist view against physical reductionism. And that's playing out in the philosophy of mind literature in that regard. Bonnie, do you have a question?
To my own question, but where I was going with it. I mean, I know your work, so I don't really have this question, but I was trying to understand why the way you were presenting it would have these confusions, right? And that is, so you start by saying naturalizing means there's one world, right? I think you said
right,
that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right.
The naturalisms assume that. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right.
Naturalists presume
okay.
that.
And so then you have to, but then now, just as Rob said, you have to argue for distinct scientific, psychology's got to be different than physics, let's say.
Yep.
Distinct. Okay. So you have one world, but many epistemologies. And so the answer to your question, which I realized, is but then that one world itself has discrete. It's a layered ontology, so you need a layered epistemology. So I said, I just bring it up because I think when you started and you emphasize this one worldness, then you get a little bit of this confusion as you go further. Like to start that hard by saying there's one world and then make these hard boundaries, I think is a little bit of what causes confusion. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
It's not really a question, but I'm just noticing that performatively that can be a little confusing at first. So
right.
Naturalism, you could say it's a one world thing, but we have to recognize without chopping up that world, there are strong discrete layers and in epistemology and level. So I would say it like that, and then I think you would avoid some of this problem here.
Right. So of course that is exactly what we're saying.
Right.
This is the halfway mark, and that's exactly the way in which we need to make sense out of the transjective onto epistemology. Precisely.
Exactly.
So,
I would just let people know that this one world thing has these other very strong, because then you come in and make very strong boundaries, and this is a little bit of the hiccup. That's all. I'm
right,
sorry to take
right.
so much
No,
time.
that's fine. Why don't I go ahead and then continue with the next part, and we'll see how this. But that is exactly if we're looking at where we're headed. Of course, that's the mystery and the way we're going to solve how different levels, layers, dimensions, realms exist both within and above the other layer. That's paradoxical, but there are ways in which the world can exist within and above various layers, and that's what we'll find out. And then once we realize that, well, we can solve a lot of these kinds of difficulties with clarity. So I'll share this, and then basically I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. But essentially, I'm going to go fast here. So how did I get here? Well, basically, I was doing meta theory, and then I had to back into a system of description fundamentally. I needed to know what science was doing as an epistemology, what it said ontologically, well, Bashkar kinds of things. This is where I'd be a critical realist. And then I needed to say, but what do we mean by mind and behavior? My second book basically did that. Okay, so this new synthesis was like, there's conceptual categories of science, behavior, and mind that have not been sorted out, and that's what that whole 500-page book that nobody reads, a few people read, did. Brendan reads it a lot, and so that argument there basically is like, hey, there's a profound puzzle piece problem here, and there's a pathway forward, very much along the lines of what Bonnie was just talking about. There's a way to make sense out of the world through a layered structure that actually is going to help me understand, or help the system understand, what science is doing as it delineates behavior across different dimensions of behavioral complexification and levels within that. And then I could figure out a way to align that. But what that ultimately meant, my argument then is that what it ultimately means is we lack a richly nuanced, coherent picture. Okay, that's up to the task. So that's what I'm basically, there's a frame on it, but it's not a richly nuanced picture that is up to the task. That's what we can move toward. I bonded, of course, with John. We did all this different stuff in relationship to our synergy, and we built this thing called extended naturalism. It came out of a transcendent naturalism where we split the problem of like, hey, there's what do we ought to do relative to the world, and ultimately extended naturalism is this idea that we can frame the world through our different systems that I think give us a new way to basically place psychology, mind, and consciousness coherently in the psychological consciousness in the world, and create a frame, naturalistic frame, that resolves an enormous amount of ambiguities about what we're talking about, and dissolves aspects, at least, of the way the hard problem is framed, clarifies what we mean by science of mindedness, clarifies what 4E cognitive science should be doing in relationship to that. Okay. And then there's this issue of strong transcendence, which fundamentally, by the way, in this model, essentially is pointing to the out and in relation, which is basically how are we going to then relate to ourselves with a proper frame, with wisdom, through a Neoplatonic Christian worldview of loving awareness, through a Zen Buddhist worldview, etc., etc. Rob Scott nails this, I think, in a particular way in relation to what he calls the fundamental shift, but I'll just point to that. Okay. And so I did this whole thing on consciousness, and that's the book that I'm doing. And it's in the process then of saying, oh, I now understand Chalmers at a deeper level. I knew what he was saying before, but I really studied what the hell he did. I read his book twice, and we talk about the hard problem of consciousness. It's very important to know that that's a specific formulation relative to the explanatory gap, how to get in there, what kinds of errors he made, and from my vantage point, blah, blah, blah. I don't have the interest. I could do a whole presentation, of course, on consciousness itself. But the point of it is that I basically was like, oh, Chalmers has confused psychological consciousness with philosophical consciousness. Okay, in this problem. And he doesn't know actually how to grip psychological consciousness because he doesn't understand the problem of psychology. He's not a psychologist, he's a physicist and a philosopher. He takes the cognitive revolution on its face as being the solution, meaning that it's a functional neuroinformation processing system, but he actually doesn't realize that he doesn't know how to define mindedness in the world. And the traditional cognitive psychology breaks down relative to what's called radical behaviorism. Okay, there's a radical behavioral Skinnerian view that never gets assimilated. Skinner holds strong, and actually, although he loses overall, he holds strong for very good reasons. There's a reason a radical behavioral view holds and still is practiced today and doesn't get absorbed by traditional. And of course, we see in cognitive science, we see 4E cognitive science. And what do both of those systems say? Actually, you can't reduce the mind to a computational functionalism inside the brain. Instead, what you have is perception action loops that are operating in higher orders of dimension that can't be reduced to inside and out. That's what they actually all say. They're contextualized systems. There's a higher order system of adaptive operation that's going on. So anyway, I'm doing this. I published this. And where all this ultimately comes from is a fight I had, a lovely fight, God love him, with Jim Rutt. So Jim Rutt reads my shit, okay? And he's like, Gregg, you're doing great shit, but I hate the fucking word extension. I mean, what the hell? This is the craziest goddamn word. This means nothing, okay? And I was like, this is emergent naturalism. All you're doing is emergent naturalism, and we have to start from the beginning, okay? And I'm working on a science of emergence, okay? Temporal reciprocal emergence, and I'm modeling it with my computer and blah, 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 And I'm giving him a big hug, and I'm like, well, Jim, I think there's other issues that are going on here and you're never going to get to your temporal reciprocal emergence throughout this whole picture, certainly not in this lifetime. And ultimately what happened in our conversation was that as he hated the word extension, okay, hated the word extension, and as I explained what extension was, ultimately what becomes part of the frame of natural philosophy that I'm proposing is the split that I realized between an emergent question, like what is emergence relative to reductionism? And we can talk a huge amount about this concept. I know Tyler has issues with this concept, but fundamentally, there's a fundamental tension between what we mean philosophically about emergence, what is novelty, what is non-aggregativity, what does it mean in relationship to the ontological reductive state of the earlier forms, what actually is new, are there new causal emergences, etc., etc. Okay, these are all a set of questions, all right, that have not been consensually agreed upon. The set of emergence, if you ask people what emergence is, it's like psychology. It's like, well, I think it's this thing, and this is what I think. Oh, I'll ask another person. I'll ask another person. I'll ask another person. Go read the literature. It's a complex network of different ideas. Okay. But I was realizing that part of the complexity is that there's two fundamentally different issues. There's the general issue of emergence, like, for example, how after the Big Bang are atoms and molecules formed and stars formed? In other words, what is chemistry in relationship to physics? Okay, that's a general question of emergence. And the general question of then what happens with novelty on a time frame in relationship to what potentially would change? And are there different levels of structural organization, like molecules versus atoms? That's one question of emergence, and it's the general question of emergence. But what I was telling Jim was, I was like, Jim, there is that question. It's a super important question. We don't have to sort it out. Maybe your complexity science people at Santa Fe and everybody else can work this out and turn it into a science kind of question. Great. Okay. And certainly the systems people have been talking about this. But there's a particular line of emergence that extends across a particular history, our natural history line. In other words, we find ourselves, for however it got here, to planet Earth. And then this is the 4 billion year trajectory that gives rise from life to mind, in my language, to culture. That's a specific kind of emergent trajectory. And I have a great friend here called Tyler, who's like, that line is called Combogenesis. Okay. There's a particular meaning that once we have emergence in general, there's the actual specific line that leads to us. And the separation then and I said to Jim, I was like, this is a philosophical problem, meaning it's a big picture problem of the concepts and categories. And this is exactly what I backed into in the problem of psychology. Okay. And then there is this extension line actually can then be placed as a separate kind of line, although it's the whole question of emergence, but there's a specific kind of emergence question that emerges initially. And then there's the particular emergence question that gets stacked in our particular historical line. Okay. And it was that distinction fundamentally that sets the stage. Okay. I'm going to slip through this, but ultimately then I realized I could frame the whole thing, and John's way of understanding cognitive understanding gives us a way to actually think I'm literally talking about a cognitive recursive relevance realizing frame that boxes in exactly what Bonnie was talking about in relationship to actually, how do I make it specific that I'm talking without being overly dogmatic? Okay, you were talking about, oh, you're just saying there's one world. Actually, I'm not saying that. I'm saying there is a way to frame the natural world, the endo-natural world. I'm not making claims about what I would call the exo-natural world in this frame. One of the nice things about this relevance frame is this is the world that I'm talking about, and I'm not making any metaphysical claims outside of it necessarily. We can talk about it, But this frame is about this world. That goes from what? What does it go? Well, here's the basic structure. Here's the core frame. And what is it? Here is what natural science has taught us. And Tyler Broke's got a great line in Quirks of Culture that he opens with. Hey, can we go, essentially says, go down. And as you go down, you essentially go back. And we have learned that we can go down into the standard model of elementary particle physics. Okay, we talk about this there, and this gives us a kind of physical ontology. All it means is I'm an organism, I'm filled with cells, my cells have molecules, they have atoms, they're made up of particles. You fix the fermion bosonic matrix, those are the two kind of particles they are, and you fix me from a physicalist perspective. Okay, in other words, if they're all in the exact same place, then I'm in the exact same place. Okay, and that is this whole issue of supervenience. And I believe that we are the physicalist picture of natural science is that we supervene on the fermion bosonic matrix. And it says that there is a sequence of events that has unfolded in our particular line. Our Luca line, last universal common ancestor, and the cosmic evolutionary line back to Big Bang, say it's 13.8 billion years ago. Okay? And this is a sequence of events that have unfolded, a cause-effect sequence. All right? And then we can trail then down and back. And the down and back gives us an ultimate root of cause, a naturalistic root of causation. That's how I was talking about with Jim Rutt. Okay? In the sense that we can factor. That's a way to historically and scientifically kind of explain in a pretty rigid and reductive way what's going on, potentially. But the question, and that gives us our back frame line. But the question is, well, wait a minute, if we were to start there, what does it look like? Like, is everything determinist by necessary and sufficient causation? Or is there an unfolding feedback loop? If you ask Alexander Bard's like, everything is fucking emergent, okay, philosophically. And there is no meta law of emergence, and anybody says so has a boy pharaoh problem or whatever. Okay, you're trying to learn about, trying to gain control of a god-like structure, and it can't happen. All right. So this is a question, I would argue, for natural philosophy. What is emergence for our group? And how to best frame it? Okay. What does it mean? I think it's a philosophical question. But ultimately, then, the issue is that's one question. And then you have this extension question, which is a second question, okay? And ultimately, the tree of emergence, if we want to call it that, whatever, is a placeholder for the up, okay? And then fundamentally, can we get a picture of the over? Now, we have the general picture. It is true that we have a time by complexity general picture. But it's not a picture that places us in the world, I would argue, coherently. Just if I ask all my graduate students, what is mind, what is self, what is consciousness, and they all can't answer that question ontologically, then at least science of psychology is not telling people what it is. Okay? They're not telling people what it is. And if you're not telling people what it is, we're not doing a job. I'll put it that way. Are we doing some job? Sure. Okay? But there is a fundamental problem with the Enlightenment gap that places us in the world. And I'm arguing that actually embedded in this group, if I read what people have done, here is the orders of nature. This actually aligns a particular way. And of course, the tree of knowledge and the orders of nature align. And here's the Combogenesis line of Quirks to Culture. And when you stack those things together and we bind them together and add a few key pieces, like-mindedness and justification, you then actually can address the problem of psychology, clarify what we mean by mind, get clear about the hard problem of consciousness and psychological consciousness, and then actually situate people in the world. And then ultimately we're going to situate them in the world to be aware of what science is and be aware of how to connect to the Eastern Enlightenment. And so that's the basic structure. The working group then would be like, hey, what are we talking about with this emergence and versus reduction vector? How do we clarify the over vector? And, am I being excessive in all my claims about nobody knows what they're talking about and listen to me? Now, I don't mean to say that. Okay. I know I come across that way sometimes. All right. But I am making something very important. And then we have to figure out how to frame that in a way that's actually digestible and valid. Then there's this whole issue of what the over and out vectors are. Out and in vectors are, and why this frame. And this is what I'll be talking with Barron and Rob Scott about. Okay. And this endo versus exo is super important too. It gives us a way to talk about it without being arrogant. Okay. It just says here, and this is our friend Sean. Hey, Sean, you do exo studies. Great. Let's talk about that. I'm not making any claims about that. I'm trying to get this particular frame clear. Okay. And we can then wonder about we got to clarify the natural history, natural science relation, and explore the worldview implications. So I talk with Larry, talk with Tyler about this frame. talk with Rob and Baron about the fundamental shift in and out, talk with my love about how you talk is a particular kind of natural philosophy, and talk guys here about worldview and what are the implications. Okay. So that's what I hope we'll be able to do going forward there. That's what I needed to get through so we could then get to the rest of this and wrap it up. All right.
Well, I'll just say real quick, Greg, I really appreciated this. Something really clicked for me in this presentation, which was the uh, up and over elements, which just weren't really landing for me before. But you have carved up sort of the questions in I think in a very clear way. And I don't really have much. I'll have to digest for a minute. But I did just want to communicate that I really appreciated this presentation because the whole kind of gestalt kind of clicked, and the distinction between the up and the over, getting clear about that. I guess if there is a question in there, there's it. I am curious how there might be. So if you separate out the question of emergence as sort of the up vector, and then the question of sort of big history, Combogenesis, a particular almost subset of emergence that has occurred over big history. I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit about what some of those really important distinctions are, not at the level of philosophical questions, but is it something like, oh, well, we can talk about emergence in the murmuration of starlings, and that's cool, that's emergence, but it has nothing to do with combogenesis in terms of telling the story of human kind of where we come from. Would that be a good way? Like basically, the set of emergent phenomena is much broader than the set of what you'd call the combogenesis, evolutionary story of big history, something like that.
That's certainly related. Absolutely. And this is to Tyler's point. I mean, Tyler, I can't recommend this book enough in terms of the architecture of the holonic complexification process that is combogenesis. And that's a crucial, different kind of thing we need to be thinking about than just emergence in general. Okay. It's a specific kind in a specific line. And there's a much broader set of emergence in general. The thing that I want to say is there's also the set of emergence in Earth versus the universe, right? Okay. And the kind of emergences that they're doing when they're trying to do the science of early emergence, like what Jim Rudd is doing, just different levels, which would speak to, for example, the chemistry, the physics to chemistry, atom to molecule jump, which is, of course, happening, as far as we know, in the observable universe. That's why we can look out. We know that stars have a particular atomic structure, right? And then stars are organized. So that kind of emergence, physics to chemistry, is happening across the entire galaxy, or galaxies and universe. The kind of emergence that goes from, say, prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, right? That kind of complexification. Well, we have one line of doing that, and we want to contextualize that line. And if we're really asking, how the hell did we get here, and do we have a coherent story of us as humans, then that is the specific combogenic line. And we have to characterize that as a particular kind of question about emergence. I'm saying, oh, that's the extended line of emergence. And that's what Tyler identified as the combogenic line. Tyler, you want to pop in there? You're muted.
Sorry, that was an important discussion about the maybe families of emergence, Brendan. This is, I think, very important to clarify that. Greg, what's your node between the up and over arrows? Because the node from the down to the standard model, and then the node over to the Big Bang, and some of that's very clear. But what's your current thinking on the node?
I think you could identify that as the trail of life that leads to us.
So you're thinking of the over arrow beginning with the origin of life, then?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable, like we're trying to find the biopsychosocial complexification of our particular historical line.
Yeah. Okay. So you don't have that in there because I was thinking you were going to start it with animal mindedness, but
No,
that
it's
was my
definitely before that. No, it's the three emergent layers of life, organism, mind, animal, and culture, person that gives us the biopsychosocial developmental history
Yeah.
of us, for sure. Yeah, it wouldn't be mind and animal there.
Right. So the up arrow So emergence actually, as the philosophical term, or as a subset of steps that get to us, emergence is going to be in the over arrow as well as the up arrow.
Totally. In
Totally.
fact, right. The generalized, as you say in your book, there's this generalized emergence, right?
Right.
That's
Right.
on the up arrow.
Right. So
And then there's a particular
eukaryotic
kind
cell
of
to you right. So eukaryotic cell to multicellularity, you're putting in the over arrow right now
100%.
in a
Yeah,
biological emergence. Okay.
exactly.
How you're
And
currently.
I would say, and if you look at the big history tree and the idea of what consilience is, our scientific knowledge, I mean, in our coherent, hard ontological knowledge of going from, we obviously the jump to real, actual life it remains a, who do you ask? Is it alkaline vents and is it warm pools? Is it astrobiology? We still have a pretty, big set of questions. But once we get Luca, right? And then we can jump into prokaryotic to eukaryotic, and then we distribute across the kingdoms. And then we go to animals, and we can specify this at the level of brain activity and behavioral activity. Okay. And we can trail that. And all of that then is biology. The language of biology sits and is nicely structured, I would argue, ontologically. A lot of debate, but reasonably well done until you get to whatever it is that psychology is trying to point to.
Okay.
That's my basic point. And that's when and you have to then find what psychology is and then go. Look at Hartman. Okay. So, I mean, and then go from there. Hartman, when he does his 4 levels, he calls the 3rd level psyche, right? And then he identifies it as, like Rob was talking about, there's this subjective, constructive thing of the world, but we don't even know when it exists, how it exists, or where it exists. But that's the domain I'm pointing to. Okay. And I'm saying that the proper construction of psychology actually doesn't make it subjective the way Rob's talking. It holds subjectivity, but it holds a particular behavioral angle on it as well. Okay. And it properly places subjective relative to the objective behavioral. That's what I learned from B.F. Skinner. Okay. B.F. Skinner taught me how to do that, of all people. Okay. But he does it in a fascinating way. He overshoots by far the behavioral angle. But actually, trailing B.F. Skinner really is interesting. I thought he was full of shit. He turns out to be a pretty bright dude.
So, Greg, I'm hearing the up as more of almost like a transcendental philosophical argument for the possibility and conditions of emergence, generally speaking. Um, whereas the over, I'm hearing more as a path dependent, in situated, historical, local to our part of the universe, actual story of how that occurred then, given what I think Wolfram talks about a Rulliad, something occurring within the adjacent possible, but you have this
Yep.
massive singularity of all these infinite adjacent possibles, but then the Rulliad is this sort of path through it.
Lovely. Yeah, I think my only hesitation, I guess it depends on, we'd want to get a bunch of people in the room talking about that, and you would get different views. So you get the Alexander Bard view on the philosophical emergence side, and it is transcendent, it is this, it's unspecifiable. You get like, what is it? Anderson's, who's does more is different. The classic 1972 chemistry article, right? That's more grounded in the physical sciences than somebody like Bard's going to be. The question is, how much can you reduce chemistry to the quantum is a great question. And then what does that mean in terms of like, but that is exactly where all of that is located. That's my point. Is like that's we need to, and it's confusing. But all of
Yeah,
those
and the,
things are
and the
located in
process
that space.
philosophy, I mean, process philosophy is going to have a lot to say about this from the point of view of novelty and the
Totally.
arrow of time and what is genuinely emergent as the possible next, right? And
Right.
and as genuinely creative, which I don't think we've fully processed what that actually means when you kind
Well,
of
I
sit
think,
with it and marinate with it.
did Bard call you the daughter of Whitehead, Bonnie? So you'll be here to talk a little bit about that.
Sorry, what was the
Now, Rob just pointed out that the process philosophy orientation in relationship to novelty and emergence is crucial to consider in all of this
yeah.
and framing it effectively.
Depends on how rigorous you want to be in this, but I put in the chat 2 excellent books by Carl Gillett. One's an anthology that he edited, and if you read them, I don't buy, you don't have to buy into the whole thing, but he shows in a very rigorous way what these words mean in science. And for just something you could just rip off, which he says exactly, I use it all the time, that in order to show true emergence, not just the way we use the word, you have to prove that there are new properties, processes, and powers. So that makes it a scientifically, empirically testable term. He ends up in one of his books, sorry, I'm not sure which one, I think it's the one he wrote himself, talking about the horizons of scientifically rigorous versions of emergence, and he has models similar to a naturalized. So it goes somewhere which I think might be helpful. But you know, if you're writing about this, Gregg, and you want rigorous citations, then they can come directly out of that book. You know, you can use, he has like 5 different versions. You can say, I'm using this one.
I don't know if you recall this, but we had to convert. You already sent me to him, and I reviewed him.
Yeah.
So yeah, totally. I have. So I got a whole list of emergence versus reduction kinds of things, and he's high on that list of things that we want to be
and they're
aware
readable.
Of.
Like a lot
absolutely.
of times, these books are not readable. This
right.
one's
No,
very...
it's not. So great. Yes.
Oh, okay, I already did. Sorry. Go back to...
No, that's fine. It was super helpful, actually. I learned a lot from him. Mark?
Yes, Greg, you know, I'm a Vygotsky fan like you are. So where would you place Vygotskian sort of mediation within the schema?
Totally. Right. And so I would not be, I'll put it this way. If I were Russian born, I would have adopted Russian activity theory and Vygotskian modeling for the world and not had the same problem. Okay. So my problem, so Russian activity theory actually basically gets mindedness correct. Okay. So I want to be clear. I situate this in a particular set. Now, not with the precision that I actually can now get it because it was clusterfucked and we fixed it. Okay. And the way, the way it gets fixed, Vygotsky's struggling with this stuff, but he binds and they bind to Russian activity theory and then the tool use of language and the iterative process of development. Okay, which like modern Tomasello picks up on, and the development of culture tool structure, okay, is basically, that's relatively coherent. So Vygotsky is obviously, Vygotsky's pretty much picking up, he goes to see oh God, we don't know what psychology is. He surveys the crisis. He essentially sees the animal versus human. He finds the language tool developmental structure through proximal development and shows how basically culture's popping out in humans differently than in animals, grounded in Russian activity theory. So he basically is taking what I would call mindedness, animal mindedness, and the culture person plane of existence, although he binds the language in a slightly different way than justification, but it's very similar overall. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. And I'm just thinking, you know, one of the great moves of Vygotsky is that he takes up what he calls a unit of analysis across some of these gaps. You know, so his unit of analysis it's like word meaning, right? So it's one unit, but it moves across the subjective objective split. And he takes that as the unit of analysis, which is a really beautiful move. Really.
No, it's a beautiful move. He's definitely.
It's the same as Marx with his move towards practice. You know, so human, what's he say? Sensuous human activity. It was his unit of analysis, which moves across, you know, consciousness, behavior. It just dissolves those whole sort of splits with these nice analytical moves.
Yeah, so one of the things I should be clear about, because sometimes I get all passionate and all that stuff, but I mean, as I think people know, my entire journey starts with the problem of justification. Okay, like that's 1996, and then I contextualize that, and I live inside. Then I bind to social construction. Okay, and then I shift over to a much more natural ontological perspective, but that's essentially where I'm nested in. And I say that because I want us to this proposal is nested in relationship to a socio-historical context of justification. Okay, in other words, I wouldn't be making this proposal if I were in Confucian China right now, right? I mean, all of what I'm saying about how you define behavior, how things get defined in relationship to like who is saying what do we know? Okay, I'm grasping a particular natural science, psychology, social science architecture in coming off of Europe into the United States. I am situated American psychology, okay, and it struggles. So it takes a Jamesian view, it takes some, in relation, and then it tries to bind, and it's got a behaviorist problem, it's got a psychodynamic problem, it's got a humanistic problem, and then it creates certain kinds of confusions. Okay. And those confusions then create absences of understanding that I fell into. And to then fill in the absence of understanding, okay. I mean, think about Aristotle. What are his fucking four scholars of nature? They're the same goddamn things I'm talking about. So Aristotle wouldn't have had this problem. He's like, oh, of course, there's a sensory motor layer of animal mindedness. He wouldn't use exactly that term, but you plants and what is animal? Oh, it's a sensory motor loop. So, we forgot that. That's in a history of justification. So that's part of the dynamic that I think I want to be. And that's why in 21st century, this thing's going to be done. I'm not a foundationalist. After things get internalized, there's going to open up to other kinds of things, and novel systems will then emerge. And what becomes issues of concern are no longer issues of concern. And a lot of what I'm pointing to are contextually issued concerns, knowledge-wise. Brendan, you have a point?
I'm curious. I'm still thinking a lot about this up and over aspect and the distinctions between them. And one of the things that I was thinking a lot about when you were talking about emergence was Eric Hull's theory of causal emergence. And that seems like a very tidy sort of account for, what these different levels are at the level of sort of like coarse graining of information, et cetera. But that strikes me as sort of an ontological epistemological kind of approach to the question of emergence. It doesn't necessarily tell you like what's going on. I guess maybe this is what I'm interested in, is sort of like the question of emergence as sort of epistemological or ontological is sort of almost question cluster A. And then related to that, though, is in the over vector, in your tree of life model, tree of knowledge rather, you've got information processing systems that are the nodes that lead to these new layers. And that's a distinct kind of causal mechanism, or what would you say? A kind of, a root structure that is sort of the source of an emergent level, which doesn't necessarily exist in other emergent contexts. Like starling murmurations don't come from an information processing regimen. Totally. And so it would seem like there's something there interesting to explore that I'd be interested to, I'd be part of in these conversations of like taking emergence as a broad category and then focusing on that combogenetic line as sort of a distinct form of that as rooted in distinct information processing revolutions. That seems to be a way in which these different kinds of emergences are meaningfully separated. And it also, as it occurs to me, is like if before life, there isn't really information processing in the same sort of way. If you really think about genetic information processing as the first of these emergent revolutions, that is kind of the beginning of where that over branch starts, that over vector starts. Because before that, I mean, what's going on in chemistry is not necessarily the emergence of an information processing, structure. It's just a kind of different kind of emergence. So anyway, I'm curious about those two elements of sort of causal emergence and how that relates to sort of the ontological thing, and whether information processing revolutions is kind of the ontological aspect of the over branch, if that makes sense.
Great. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd be interested to see what Howell said about your point about ontology versus epistemology, because I do hear in his theory of causal emergence that this is not just an epistemological leveling structure. There are macroscopic iterative processes that are happening statistically, and therefore not statistically in the sense that, because we have subjective ignorance about, but ontologically, statistically, that this macro level is up impacting this macro level. And we can then see how that operates. So I believe, in my take on Whole, is that his theory of causal emergence goes back to Bonnie's point, and it's like, actually, there are ways to deliver causal powers in relationship to this that are ontologically specified, not just because we need to talk about them that way, but because they're actually happening that way ontologically. I don't know if you would agree with that, but that's one point. The second point I want to say is actually there's two different things that we need to be paying attention to when we talk about Combogenesis and the overline. Okay. So combogenesis is what Tyler points to is represented in the periodic table of behavior. Okay, that's the part whole group, part whole group, part whole group structure. And what that represents is a particular kind of structural functional binding that gives rise to a metastable whole that then produces particular kinds of patterns. Okay, so part of the combogenesis line, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we start at the beginning, there is a combogenesis line that goes from particles to atoms. And there's an atom to molecule. Why? Because when we talk about the structural functional holonic organization, that's actually where we start. However, something does significant happen at the lifeline. Okay. And my argument is exactly that the reason the topology of the tree of knowledge has its structure, it's not just one increasing cone. Okay. It's four increasing cones. There is a meta dimension of operation that happens. And this relates directly to the problem of emergence causality. What I argue is that it's information processing within, and this is super important, communication between. Okay? Information processing within and communication within, between systems. And what I suggest is that when you have an information processing system, it's pulling macroscopic form, semantically meaning that macroscopic form of even an agent of a cell, if you want to call that. It's energy, information, and matter, semantically meaning. And then it can communicate a message that then gets picked up by another cell. Okay? People seem to always be like, oh, we're going to create a stack of causal closure. Like this is what, Hararo saying. People, well, everybody reduce everything to causal closure because the macroscopic supervenes on the microscopic. Okay? But when you do information processing forms, what is happening there? You're taking the form, detecting that informationally, pulling it off the microscopic. We write about this in the book. Okay? So when you relate to me, you don't relate to my microscopic particles. You relate to me as Gregg that becomes an informationally semantic relevant object that no longer is attached to me, but it's having causal power. So I argue that information processing communication networks operate on form and that are disconnected from the microscopic causal closure problem. And as a function of that, they create a meta dimension of causal powers and properties that's topologically represented by the shape of the tree of knowledge. And that's why actually there are three different distinct dimensions, because there's genes and cells and organisms. That's one kind of information process, the biological, that's doing, and use Michael Levin's terms, hey, this is morphological, this is physiological and transcriptive kinds of problem solving through an information processing communicative network. And then you have 3D behavioral problem solving of animals that's running through a nervous system operating on a neuromuscular structure, moving animals around, which is then a higher order. And of course, what are we doing now? Propositional language. So each one of those structures is an information processing structure nested, creating then a meta dimension that's both within at one level, but above at another. That's what the TOK represents. Larry's got a question, but then I left behind. Larry's got a question. I'll come back to you.
Sure. I was just going to say in response to Brendan's question to you that, there's a number of ways to think about emergence. As Gregg and Tyler know, I think about it in a certain way. It mostly comes from William Wimsatt's work, which is really based in the philosophy of biology, but applies to other things. Anyway, if you think of emergence simply as a limit on the adequacy of reductive explanation. So you have a system, it's nothing wrong with trying to explain it in terms of the interaction rules operating on its parts. But when you run up against a limit of that and you can't explain the properties of a system, usually you can explain some of them reductively, but others not. Now, when you get to those properties that can't be explained reductively, which could be for a number of reasons, but a common reason is the complexity of the organization is imposing certain conditions on the N-1, the lower level parts. So when they make, if you will, a contribution to the whole, it's already been pre-digested or limited by the whole. So anyway, when that happens, then in order to explain what's going on, you can't just refer to the parts and the interaction rules anymore. So that's a limit on explanation. But then you have to say there's something there about the whole which is causally relevant. And I would say this, emergence without downward causation is kind of pointless. So it's that there's something about the whole can't be reduced, and it's making a difference to what happens. So the explanatory leads to maybe the explanatory necessity of something emergent, which just means it's not reducible. And then, if you want to talk about ontology, which some of us do, I would just say, um, why posit an ontology unless it's explanatory? In other words, when you're looking for the explanation of what happens in the world, that should lead you to your view of what's ultimately going on and causing those things. So then the explanatory role of emergence to me leads naturally and inevitably to a claim about what is there in the world that's making a difference to what happens. So the two go together. That's what I'd say.
That's beautiful. I just plug it. So one of the things I'd love for us to talk about is start with that conception of emergence, okay? And because I think that's the minimum viable elements, and then start to look at a taxonomy of the kinds of things that meet that criteria. Okay. Three immediately come to mind in my little survey. One, they're dissipative structures. Okay. Dissipative structures that, Prigogine talks about and things like that. There are higher order energy flow structures that create metastable patterns that create the constraints. This is what Terence Deacon's talking about in Incomplete Nature. Okay. You run energy through particular types of substances like Bernard cells, and you get a particular kind of organization that then feeds back on, because of energy flow structures, constraints, whirlpools, etc. There are a lot of different aggregate energy flows that create a particular kind of organization to create top-down constraints. There are also particular kinds of binding structures, like atoms, like particles. An electron binds to a proton in a particular way to create a metastable polarchy pattern. Okay, and then finally, there's the jumps of planar jumps, where you're getting from matter to life, life to mind, as a function of a system of information processing communication networks creating ecology, an emanating ecology, that then it creates a different kind of operating structure, agency in the world. So there's at least three. Then we can have a whole taxonomy of different kinds of emergences. There's a criteria. I think the criteria Larry's talking about is very similar to criteria that Bonnie represented, right? And then you can have different ideas about what emergence are. And all I'm saying is a natural philosophy of emergence. Right? The absence, I'll put it this way, the early emergent evolutionists, the 1920 emergent evolutionists got around, they had supervenience and they thought supervenience saved them. That was what they thought. But actually, the way they frame supervenience, so Jagon Kim comes along and pops the bubble explicitly. But then the positivists question that, and they didn't get it right. Okay, and then we have this sort of shit show of confusion in relationship to this concept. But I think there's an opportunity to get, and then once we up it and then over it and get both of those right, we've now bound the picture. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, right on, Greg. Yeah, well, zooming out a little bit, I just think that the framing of all this as natural philosophy 2.0, I think is really skillful and important, and it's exciting to me. Coming out of the Vermont Symposium, that's like a lot of what I was thinking about in relation to your work was like, this is natural philosophy. That's the most honest and precise way to name what you're doing, and I think the kind of revindication of the philosophical frame in relation to these kinds of questions that have typically been kind of co-opted by science, I think is really powerful, because obviously we can't dissociate philosophy. I mean, the good scientists in these realms are doing philosophy whether they acknowledge that or not.
Totally.
And I think that's a powerful strategic move to help kind of bridge the Enlightenment gap and start to reweave the dissociated spheres. So yeah, I'm excited about what you're doing on that level. And then zooming in a little bit, where my mind goes. Sorry to be the critical realist guy that's always hammering on that, but um, so I think you do a beautiful job of drawing on Boscar's kind of general transcendental realism, but I'm curious how much you've gotten into like some of his specific formulations around emergence and holistic causality and synchronic emergent powers materialism and things like that. Because in my view, he's worked out a lot of nuanced stuff. And how I'm seeing it is that you do bring a lot to that he hasn't articulated, but right now I'm seeing a lot of that in terms of bringing like more concrete and substantive scientific nuance to fill in the, the details of what he's saying, but it seems totally compatible. So I'm just curious how much you've gotten into that aspect of his work.
You're making a great point. Certainly, I've absolutely deep respect for, of course, for a real legendary contributor who has added more philosophical laboring to those kinds of angles and so that's what the unified worldview kind of thing was, right? It was sort of like, hey, here I've got this piece, and Wilber's doing his thing developmentally, consciously, and Bhaskar's doing his thing with ontology and the philosophical underlaboring. And while I have read quite a bit of Bhaskar and I basically just nod along, although not always because he's not super easy to read all the time, but his structure is really clear to me and super aligned. And he's a philosopher. I'm not actually trained as a philosopher. He's doing philosophical underlaboring and he's doing a technical analysis of that. I haven't found anything that I find in disagreement with. That's just synergy to be had, as far as I'm concerned. So, yes.
Yeah,
I
great.
was going to say that I think dialectical critical realism has done a lot of the philosophical underlaboring for the entire up move in a hugely powerful way.
Yeah, and I think it's just waiting for that kind of more scientifically informed layer of detail. So, and the metaphor that was coming to me earlier was like, there's the Enlightenment gap, and you can think of that like there's a chasm, there's a canyon, and you're trying to bridge the gap. And I feel like people like Bhaskar have been systematically building scaffolding the whole time, but now we're at this point where we're ready to come in and like actually start building the bridge. And I think you're doing amazing
100%.
work along those lines. So.
And absolutely, of all the people, well, they're somebody like I didn't mention. I'd love to reach out to is the semiotic Soren Brewer. Like there are a lot of people, of course, that are and Bhaskar's just awesome. I mean, I'd love and by the way, I would say one of the things that both the dialectical stuff, which some of the more abstract talk stuff does get into, but fundamentally the meta reality and the out and in stuff, right? I think that that'd be another whole area. And the out and in stuff is just a pointer. I mean, that's like, so I'd love to explore the out and in vectors as I'm thinking about them with his meta reality awakening.
Yeah, the
Mike,
transcendental
yeah,
arguments for absence as causal is going to be where a lot of this sits in terms of the philosophical problem of emergence.
right. And I do a lot. I don't speak to it here, but I do a lot with real, actual empirical structure.
Yeah.
And we talk and then put that in a void and blah blah blah. Void
Sorry,
Monday.
Michael, I keep running over your hand. I'll turn on mute.
Hey, Mike. I'm muted.
Hi, y'all. I want to try to pick up on what some people have talked about with respect to emergence, power, and downward causality. It seems to me that if I had to define emergence, I would define it as the idea that the whole contains properties that are not found in the constituents, either alone or in a linear combination. So you get emergent properties. The question then becomes, what type of emergent powers, which I think I heard Bonnie say, and then the question of downward causality, which I think Larry was talking about. There's a problem with downward causality, and Kim identified it. You can't have an emergent structure and have powers that violate the properties of the constituents. That can't happen. So the question becomes, how do we understand emergence and the role of emergence in everyday action? I want to talk about consciousness as an example. So Sperry talked about the emergence of mind, and he said that the mind is an emergent structure and it has powers that exert downward control. That violates the physical properties. The problem here is that I think where we get stuck with consciousness is that we think consciousness is control. That with consciousness, we have the power to control our action. And consciousness is this kind of central power, something or other. There's where we go wrong, in my opinion. The E. coli and every organism has hierarchical structure and hierarchical control built right into the biological process. We don't need consciousness to exert any downward control in that way. Consciousness must have some other function that exerts some sort of control or regulation, but without that sort of thing, so that the emergent structure can live with the lower level structures. That's what we got to move toward. That's hard, but interesting. That's all I got.
Yeah, no, actually. So Sperry's articulation, there's a linear, this is all gets in philosophy of mind. This is where everything gets all complicated. Okay. And then there are different, at least broad classes of emergence categories. So Sperry, I believe, although this is before his formulation, Colin McGinn formulates strong emergence. Okay. Strong emergence is a particular, almost magical kind of inexplicable category of properties that then is going to have causal power. And he identifies really consciousness needs to be one of these kinds of things. I think the way Sperry was thinking about it would have that kind of lineage. Okay. We address this in the book about what strong emergence says and its counterpart, which is much more broadly sort of accepted in science, weak emergence. But weak emergence actually isn't strong enough, and strong emergence is too strong. That's basically the way we put it in our extended emergence analysis that John and I do in the book. So we delineate that. We walk the thread in relationship to that, and it relates to a lot of the things that we're talking about here. And by the way, part of what we're doing with consciousness is instantiating it in the system very similarly in the way you're talking about. So we can talk about that. But cool. Bonnie?
Just a couple of first of all, I had a question for Rob, but he's gone, and maybe I'll state it afterwards. So kind of building on what Michael said, but totally different flavor. I think we have to be very careful, and I know that you're presenting an argument here for this presentation, but one of the things that I think these intellectual groups are vulnerable to is over defending an argument. In the process of defending an argument, we overstate the phenomenon. So, and this is a little bit, I think, what Michael was saying. So let me just give you some examples. So let's say we're doing like a Michael Levin thing, and we're talking about emergence as these cognitive light cones. Certainly, I worry about things that my cells don't worry about. But that doesn't mean that my cells are not playing an ongoing participatory role in me worrying about the stock market. And when we talk about these levels, it's as if the higher level that I can get in somehow does not need the continual ongoing participation of all the other levels. It also always has to be recursively included. And I think that as people become more and more comfortable with stating these discrete emergence, you're going to lose that aspect of it. And I think that's really dangerous. So let me give you another sense of why this is important. I'll give you two examples. And I think all of these very high level conversations need humble contact with ordinary experience. Okay. So the Buddhists, the supervenience people like to say, I get up and I walk across the room. My cells have no choice but to go with me. But if I'm doing my meditation, what I realize is, why do I want to get up and walk across the room in the first place? And something is percolating in me that's not me. So it's not really clear where the get up and walk across the room is. I mean, this is actually more integrative. And we're running a journal called Integration, and I think we should be more sensitive to this more real phenomena that sits somehow in between the strong emergence and the weak emergence and this and that. And I think, so that's one example. Now,
okay, can I speak to that real fast?
No, I want to finish and then, okay. So that's one. There's similar examples. So that's one example. And if you think about us flying around the galaxy on the Earth, do we have no choice? Does the Earth supervene on us? Well, you would never use that language, and you would understand that we enjoy the properties, the powers, and the processes that come from the Earth zooming us around the universe. And I would say that's similar to myself. Now, I'm going to tell you another thing that's been on my mind that really crystallizes this for me. So, the last 18 months, I've been taking care of my mom who's dying. She's very near the end of her journey. She has cancer. So, when she came home from the nursing home, she needed a lot of really good meal planning because the food in the nursing homes was killing her. So, over 18 months, this has been a very interesting process of what is good for her intestines and what's good for her mind. And then one day I realized it because she's cognitively not there, that the cancer cells have direct access to my meal planning behavior. They just do because she can't eat protein. She used to eat lots of meat. She doesn't want meat anymore because the cancer cells can't produce meat. And then she wants carbohydrates. Now she wants sugar. And little by little, I realized that all this way I was thinking, like, what does she want? Blah, 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 blah. It was actually the cancer cells have direct access to my behavior. I think these things are real. They're not just poetry. And I think that this is the kind of contribution we could make to the future of these kinds of studies. Anyways, it's just a little aside, and I just thought I would put that on the table.
Well, first, let me just kind of acknowledge that at a personal level. I'm feeling it's been a little while since I've checked on upstairs. My mom is pretty late stage Alzheimer's these days. So watching your mother die is something I have. She's dying from the top down, so it's her what I would say her mind three justification system has just completely frayed, and so the other thing that I wanted to say in real, I completely agree. And one of the concepts I've landed on that I think I got purchased with Larry and Tyler on is what I called the fermion bosonic matrix. So fermions and bosons are the two kinds of particles, like an electron's a fermion and a photon's a boson. But really, there are only these two kinds in the standard model. They're just these two kinds of structures. And at one day, I was just sort of talking about it's just a. I'm a particular. I was actually reading Bernardo Castro's work, and he's like, I'm trying to figure out what you're talking about, dude, but here's what I think really I am. I am a differentiation of the fermionic bosonic matrix at some level, in the sense that I am inside of me in a particular way. I'm stacked across. And ever since I've said that, it's given me a particular, and when you were speaking then about my cells, okay, so at least that, like, that instantiation and utilizing that term and utilizing the network of fermion bosons across the structures of Combogenesis, okay, keeps me bound in that way. And so that's why I wanted to say that, or at least I feel even more bound to my cells and to my protons than I did before, at least with that propositional frame of reference. So I wanted to say that.
Yeah. So, and I know I'm a hair splitter. Bound to me is the wrong word. That's, I think, what Michael was saying, like this control. So now am I bound to this? It opens this participatory space. Like, oh my God, like all of this symphony has to happen for me to say it has to happen.
I'm totally fine with the participant. You know, I love John's stuff, and the ground of that is participating.
I wouldn't say it's a bounding metaphor. It's the opposite. That's all. Okay.
Right. It's the frame of reference relative to the shift, not this that affords the binding. Not the bounding as like, oh, I'm bound, like I'm now handcuffed. Tyler.
So the issues that are being raised by Michael and Bonnie seem to me have to do with how do we internalize all these vectors or all these levels. I mean, internalize meaning how do we use them in our experience? Because to say, what did you say, Greg? You're a differentiation of the fermion boson matrix, or you're something like that, or
Well, right.
multiple
You have to know Bernardo's work and what he's trying to
multiple
justify.
scales of
Yeah.
crystallization or
So,
multiple scales of combogenesis. So I mean, I do like that in the sense that how does all this work relate to common experience? Does it inform? I used to teach lessons from the biosphere to NYU students. They didn't really need to know about the extinction of the dinosaurs or anything like, in a certain sense, they don't need to know it. But somehow my role to try to get them to think, well, if this did not happen, we might not be here in the way that we're here, um, with this event of an asteroid impact on the planet. And I think that has to do with also what Bonnie's saying about the cells and uh, I'm just free associating and not in a very coherent way here, but how, that knowing all the levels, knowing that they're in play, knowing that in a way I think what Bonnie's saying is you we're obligated to play with these things mentally. Maybe I'll leave it at that, and have it help inform our daily bread of experience. And
amen to that.
is that a part of to what part of that what does that play in the integration idea or in the natural history idea? I think is the question.
Right. Well, to me, what that immediate once we start to get into what does it mean for being in the world, then we start to point to the out-in dynamic in various ways.
Mhm. Mhm. Which I'm glad
All
that
right.
you brought that in.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll look forward to it. We'll expand on that. So anyway, this has been lovely. I deeply appreciate the beautiful engagement, folks.
Take care,
Glad to-
folks.
All righty.
Thank you,
Bye.
Greg.
Yep.
Thanks
See
a
you.
lot.
Yep.